Hello, welcome everyone. To this lunchtime lecture. Thank you very much for coming to the gallery, and welcome to the viewers on the YouTube channel who are tuning in. As you know, we're going to talk a little bit about this exhibition, but before we do that, I think we should introduce ourselves. My name is Bart Cornelis. I'm the curator of Dutch and Flemish paintings here at the gallery. And Daniel Herrmann is the curator of, you might want to say yourself.
I'll give it a try. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Daniel Herrmann. I'm the curator of special projects at the National Gallery, which means that, among other things, I'm currently developing the program of contemporary and modern exhibitions here at the National Gallery, which we will launch from the summer of this year onwards. So on the one hand, I feel extremely privileged to get to work with Bart and his vast knowledge of the collection, especially of course, Dutch and Flemish art. But I'm also extremely sad that I actually did not get to work with Tacita because this was an exhibition that has been long in the making, and I only joined in October. However, Bart, you did get to work with Tacita. How did the exhibition come about? What are we actually looking at?
Well, I mean, the exhibition came about really, if I remember correctly, the first, I mean, it was actually conceived before I joined the gallery. So, I mean, it's, in that sense, I wasn't there at the very first moment. But the RA was going to do a show with Tacita on the subject of landscape. And I think that's, at that point, the MPG decided to join with an exhibition devoted to, as is appropriate for that gallery, on portraiture, and then it happened quite organically. I don't think there was a plan beforehand, and it was thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if she would actually then tackle another genre, namely still life, at the National Gallery. And that way, I think it grew organically, and I think it's quite nice that those three major genres of that are usually associated with painting, not necessarily, but they often are, that she has this opportunity to explore all three over three institutions, quite a sort of unprecedented collaboration.
I think that's right, and I think that's actually something that interests me as a specialist for 20th and 21st century art, that with Tacita here in Britain, we have one of the leading artists in the field of mainly moving image, one of the really best, most important, most relevant, and most impactful artists, even though one can debate those terms, but one of the most interesting artists from Britain. And for her to be given such an interesting canvas across three London institutions, that's unprecedented. I think that's correct. I think that's really interesting. I think for an artist, that's also quite challenging. How did you experience the project coming about, and how did Tacita as an artist deal with the subject of still life?
Well, it was very interesting because, of course, we are so preconditioned, I would almost say, as art historians to approach the history of art in a certain way. And all of a sudden we are sort of pushed in the area of not knowing. And that is actually quite nice. I mean, for her, the taxonomy of these works of art doesn't necessarily count that much. For her, they're images that have a certain resonance for her, and it doesn't really matter whether they are, early Renaissance work or an 18th century painting or an early 20th century painting, so she was quite keen to choose works from both here at the National Gallery and from collections across the United Kingdom that somehow appealed to her in conjunction with her own work, because what she has done in this show is she has combined those older works with her own films, especially because, as you may or may not know, she's really, well, I wouldn't say a film artist, but film is her medium, and I should perhaps also explain at this point that film is that, and by that she really means film, as in 16mm film, the traditional way that film was made, and not digital. And so that is included in the show as well. And then she also chose a few works by her contemporaries that somehow she thought would fit in really well. And you know, it is interesting to see that process, because she, you know, we are so used to thinking of still life in a certain way. Still life is, of course, one of the oldest genres. We all know the story of what still life was about in ancient times. You know, it's you know, the ultimate way of capturing reality is often what is often thought. And you know, there's the famous story of ancient story of Zeuxis and Parrhasius, where you know, there's a contest, and and Zeuxis paints these grapes, and the birds come actually flying at the painting. And that is, well, that is fantastic. That he must be the best painter, surely. And then Parrhasius unveils his effort, and that's a painted. And then he invites Zeuxis to come and look at it, and Zeuxis says, "Oh, that's nice. I'll take away the curtain that's hanging in front of it." And of course, the curtain has been painted, and so he's fooled a human being. I mean, that story is from Plinius. That's an ancient story, and it's interesting that is sort of the context in which we all view still life often. But there is, of course, a very different side to still life, which is that it is entirely artificial at the same time, and I think that has always been recognized in the history of art.
I think that's also where Tacita feels a particular affinity, I would say, with the genre of still life. We use this story of Parrhasius and Zeuxis as a metaphor for still life. We know that it has been told by Plinius the Elder for a long time. It has been usually taken, or very often it's been taken for granted, or whereas we should probably tell it as a narrative, as a story with a grain of salt. But I think there's also something to that Tacita feels very interested in, because that's very much the discourse that we also had with the arrival of photography and then moving image. If it is about the representation of a real world, and if it's about, in a way, a mimesis of reality, if the discourse, if the discussions, if the value that we attribute to art is made through verisimilitude, well, then with the arrival of film, with the arrival of photography, what is the sense of art? What is the point of art? And
yeah,
I think that's the...
Well, and the contradiction there, because
Yep.
of course still life in itself, you would think, doesn't lend itself to the moving image.
Yep.
And in her case, it very much does. I mean, where's our... there we are. Actually, there's an image of, I suppose, which sort of illustrates that ancient story of a bird picking away. But again, the contradiction is this is more or less the first work in a display, and the contradiction is there straight away, really, because and I think that because this is a still life with a bird that's clearly very much alive, and I think for that reason she chose that as a sort of first image on the central wall, as a sort of emblem, if you want, of the entire display. And then she does this throughout the show, where she wants you to think about what is still life, and indeed then you find her own work, which has these moving images, such as I'm not sure that is the next one. Yes, there's a work that she made in 2008 called Prisoner Pair, which is essentially two pairs. There's also a pun on the word there. There's a prisoner pair. There's two pairs in a glass bowl, and they're slowly dissolving in schnapps. And that process is being filmed. And on these, what a wonderful, you must go up and see it, wonderful flush screens that have been installed, which actually makes it look as if they're front projections, but they're back projections. And so hence this photograph of someone who you would think she's in the way of the image, but she's not. And then she compared that to William Henry Hunt of the 19th century, a watercolor of apples, a very traditional still life indeed. And I think she likes to constantly challenge the viewer and try to make them make up their own minds as to what still life really is.
I think for me as a curator, that was actually one of the things that was very exciting about the project, and that is still very exciting about the exhibition, that whereas we are trained in museum environments to construct exhibitions that very often follow either a historical timeline or that make a particular point or try to tease out a particular argument, very often in a linear fashion, very often in a way that is dictated by the history of art or by certain taxonomies, such as genre categories. Working with an artist like Tacita allows us to actually rethink these very categories that we operate within. They push the boundaries of what genres could be, should be, have been. And by kind of poking at that guideline and those rules and regulations that we impose on ourselves, the artist really frees us to rethink these categories, to think about how we think about art, and to bring a bit of, I would almost say, poetry to an exhibition.
I think this one is a good example of that. This John the Baptist, I mean, the John the Baptist had there, the Italian painting, and you know, again, still life. Well, this man is clearly dead, and you know, he did this severed head on a plate to present a dead head on a plate. That of course was of interest to her, and then she compared it to this Thomas Demand photograph of two plates with a rather casual sort of, you know, elastic band placed on it, which is entirely different and yet the same sort of idea of what a still life might do. And I think that's a wonderful juxtaposition here. And I invite you to have a good look at that one. That Thomas Demand, really rather beautiful, also because the plate is actually made of paper. It's you know, from that distance you probably think it's the real thing, but it is.
Thomas Demand is a very interesting German artist who works with photography and actually models, with model making. He, any of the very often large-scale photographs that he produces are usually made by constructing miniature paper models on an architectural scale at first, and then using very well-planned lighting and camera work to make these photographs that you can see on the left-hand side, which on the first glance look extremely detailed and lifelike, and then at the second glance actually strike you in their own artificiality and in the way that they display this artificiality for everyone to see.
Yes, and she wants you to look. I think that's another thing that you want to be very careful. This is, as you said earlier, it's a sort of poetic display, and you have to take your time here. This is all about slow looking, and take your time and look at all these different things, and don't try and rush through. It's not a very large exhibition anyway, and so you can take your time, and that's very important, just to tease out those meanings. You know, there is an introductory panel, but there's no explanation here. She's quite keen herself to go without interpretation. She really wants us to go into the unknown, as it were, and make up our own minds.
Can I ask, Bart, what was it like for you as a curator working with the artist? I mean, let's maybe take this particular display as an example. How did it work? How did the artist select these works?
Well,
how did she talk to you about it?
Well, as I often find when you walk with artists, for example, through the gallery, which occasionally happens, you know, living artists, it's always interesting because they, first of all, you never get to where you want to go because they stop you in your tracks. But because they see something and they grab it, it grabs their attention, and that all of a sudden is their obsession for that moment. And she works very much like that, and she's almost like a terrier that way. If she gets something strikes her as at one point it didn't actually make it into the show, but we were walking through the gallery, and then there was this Jacopo oil sketch of a Trojan horse, and that, I mean, she had to have it. It was that moment. In the end, she decided against it, but it was she got obsessed with it because, of course, the Trojan horse is perhaps, you know, has all those things in it of still life, and yet the horse is full of people, and you know there's this. It's to her that became, you know, a moment which she savored and that she wanted to explore. And she does the same. That's how she came to these sort of juxtapositions, and some of them she's thought about, you know, for a very long time, such as I think that's this display in the second room of the exhibition, which I think the one on the right there is a painting by Paul Nash of a tree stump and a tennis ball in, I think, the Sussex Downs, if I remember correctly. It's a painting that she's actually used before, so that's one that clearly has very special meaning for her. And some of them she found by chance. I'm not actually entirely sure. There are these two paintings by Thomas Robert Guest, the pendants there in the middle, and I'm not actually sure whether she knew of them already or not, or whether they were pointed out to her. But it's very interesting to think that those two paintings. Not sure. Maybe we have a better. Yeah, here we go.
Yeah, the next one we have detail.
The two ones in the middle there. They're incredible paintings. They were painted in 1815 or 14. I can't remember now. Probably says here, 1814. You would swear those were, you know, early 20th century paintings rather than early 19th century paintings, and they were not intended as surreal works, but they have taken on this very surreal quality.
And did she find them via accident and then wrote to you, hey, these are two paintings that I think
I have to say, I'm not entirely sure what the answer is to that, because this was before I joined the gallery. Yeah. So I never asked her. I should ask her when I next see her how that actually happened, or whether she's always been very keen on a painting by John Crome, which is to the right there, which we sadly couldn't get for the exhibition. And being an artist, you have the advantage that you can make your own copy of it and display that instead. And that's a similar work, much like the Robert Guest paintings, where these paintings were just meant to record things that were found. These were archaeological finds in Wiltshire, and then they have been put into the landscape where they have been dug up, which in itself is, of course, a rather surreal moment, and that's what she likes about it. I mean, but it was originally, of course, merely a sort of display of what was going on in that area, and in fact, you know, some of these objects survived. There, I think that terracotta cup is actually in the Ashmolean Museum, if I remember correctly. So they have very different intentions, but they look so surreal to us. And the same is true for that oil sketch on the left by Wallace, a little-known British artist, which is actually here. Well, it's on long-term loan to the gallery, and from the Gear collection. And it's another beautiful instance of an artist observing one detail in a rather, well, which is set in the picture space in a rather peculiar fashion, and not what is traditionally conceived as an appropriate subject, perhaps, for a painting. And so again, that's something that she was very keen on. And
I think very quickly, if I may just interrupt there, I think also what we can see on the wall is something that I find quite important for the way that Tacita Dean works, which is we've already mentioned the term surrealism, and if we're thinking of surrealism as an aesthetic movement that encompasses visual art, painting, drawing, other forms, but also literature and literary forms of making, literary poesis. Then we can think of surrealist poetry. We can think of surrealist novels and literature, and very often these forms of art have to do with arrangement, with a cut and paste aesthetic of chance and unforeseen neighborhoods, unforeseen juxtapositions, oppositions, and almost a counterpoint in the way that elements are assembled and put together. And I think that's a very strong suit of this exhibition that we see by Tacita Dean, whereas traditional art historians might make exhibitions that have a very clear narrative and a very clear pacing of the paintings. You can see that the majority of paintings in the National Gallery are actually hung equidistantly. Very, very rarely are there groups that would suggest some kind of affinity by the paintings that aren't intrinsic to the works. Here, the artist has deliberately made groups, come up with affinities. On one hand, we have these two works by Guest, which actually are from the same series, but then also the pacing of the works on the wall follows a different rhythm than you would find in the rest of the exhibition, suggesting meaning, suggesting parallels or counterpoints between the individual works. I think that is something as a tool in exhibition making that we find in modern exhibitions and contemporary exhibitions, in exhibitions by living artists, but very, very rarely in historical exhibition spaces as we have it here at the National Gallery. Another literary tool that I think finds an echo in the Tacita Dean exhibition, particularly for works of the Surrealist period, is the method of the constitutive blank, of deliberately leaving out a particular word, figure in the landscape, leaving something for the eye of the beholder to fill in, for the ear of the reader to project into the poem, for the visitor, so to speak, to come up with their own expectations, their own additions, and their own subconscious, in the Surrealist context, their own subconscious to fill in the space that was left empty and blank by the artist. I think Dean selects works that allow for this constitutive blank within themselves. So, for instance, with the two works by Thomas Robert Guest, we know that there's archaeological items, there's a landscape, but the relationship between those two components is unclear to us. That's what makes them either eerie or fascinating or surreal. That's the emotive quality of these paintings. But the artist also positions these works in a way that suggests meaning, or at least lets us as visitors fill them with meaning. And I think that's something we see in the next slide as well.
Yeah, where she made a film especially for this exhibition called, I have to think now, Ideas for Sculpture in a Setting, that's it. I always just think of it as Henry Moore's Flints, because that's what she's done. She went to the Henry Moore archive. Henry Moore was a very fervent collector of flints, flintstones, and so she chose two, and she's put those in a landscape, or indeed inside. I think the one on the left alternates between views of that object inside and outside, and there's a diptych there of another. She's conceived it as a diptych. And another smaller screen on the right, where another flint is very slowly observed with all sorts of changing light conditions. And she's paired it, as I said earlier, that's one of her favorite paintings by Paul Nash, who has, and this time we are, of course, looking at someone who very deliberately searches for the surreal in a painting. She made this well, what has become its own composition, if you want. But I think you're absolutely right that she's a literary artist in many ways, and I think it's probably true for a lot of contemporary art that there is a literary component to it, but not unlike perhaps some older art. I mean, there's plenty of, especially Renaissance art, that of course relies very heavily on the literary subject that informs the painting. So in that sense, not that different. It now tends to be perhaps on a more poetic level, and requires more from the viewer to fill in, if you want. But I think this is a beautiful one. Again, you have to sort of make sure there is a bench, that you sit down there and observe this. For the sequences are not very long. I'm not sure this is a loop perhaps of 10 minutes or so.
And what we're looking at are these flintstones that were collected by Henry Moore in the 1930s, became part of his studio collection, and are not just emblematic of the landscape of Norfolk, which Moore was very fond of, and Dean is as well, but also are these objects that were almost like contemplative thinking stones that gave more a lot of food for thought in terms of biomorphism and biomorphic forms in geological specimens like the flintstones that he collected. Shapes, forms that do not have any particular immediate verisimilitude, very representative context, but have shapes and forms that remind us of other things that seem to be organically grown, as the discourse was at the time, but that are, of course, geologically millions of years old. Tacita converts these models that inspired Moore to some of his sculptures into a sculptural view themselves by filming them in such a way that they acquire a difference of size. She films them very often from below. She films them up close with the camera against the light, so that they seem monumental. There's a shift in scale that we would not actually be quite aware of unless we had the frame of reference that they are just flintstones. And to see that in particular in contrast to this landscape by Paul Nash gives them a certain monumentality that is quite unusual and quite wonderful to behold. Again, it's a poetic tool this time, not from the literary way of working, but from the filmmaking way of working. It's one of the things that we can see in the work of especially Russian filmmakers, especially Eisenstein is a predecessor there that Tacita would have been very well aware of. She uses this tool, she uses it in a new way to relate works of art together and to create new meaning between those works.
Yeah, and she likes the element of chance as well. I mean, I suppose that's also why she's very interested in flints. I mean, flints acquire their shape not through human hands, but through nature, and it could be any kind of shape. Well, they tend to be in one particular direction, but it is not preordained how that's going to happen, and she likes that element of chance, much like she uses film in that way. In fact, in the accompanying show, if you want, at the MPG, there is this portrait of people where she's actually masked half the film, filmed one person, then I don't know how you do it technically, but you can actually took the film all the way across the Atlantic and filmed someone else, and then then you know, that becomes one negative that she then that is projected, and the way that these people, it looks as if they're reacting to each other, but it's entirely chance. There's absolutely there's no way she could know how someone was going to react, and it is, especially when you use the medium of film, it is totally fixed. You can't, that is fixed. I mean, you can't digitally start tampering with it. So the chances that's I think also what she likes partly about the medium of film, that it is a medium that invites chance. And in that way, it's much like, as I said earlier, walking through the gallery and all of a sudden picking out a Jacopo. That to her is chance and has therefore acquires its own meaning almost on that count alone. But yeah, she's very much obsessed with that way of thinking. Although she would be loath to put it into words like I've just done. But you know, there we are. I think another one that illustrates it very nicely, and I've put the actual painting here. It's so small. This painting is the size of a postcard, and it's one of the. It's only acquired, I think, in the 90s or so by the National Gallery, or maybe a little bit earlier. I can't quite remember, but a relatively recent acquisition is a tiny little picture like that, and it is the most gorgeous view of the most unassuming subject you can imagine. You know, a wall in Naples with some laundry hanging from the balcony, and that was one she was very keen on, and I can totally see why. But it's also in the picture that makes you again realize what am I looking at? Is this? I mean, we as art historians we want to give this a name. So is this a cityscape or is this a landscape? And I've never really thought of it as a still life until she chose it, and maybe that is actually the most correct way of describing what this is, because this is in many ways is that still life, has those still life qualities, and she pairs it compares it then with this painting, again, something we would never ever do as art historians perhaps, but as an artist you are very much allowed to do that. And of this stone quality is of course what she's after here again, much like with the flints. And in this workshop of Lorenzo Monica painting of a saint being fed by another saint, the fruit is being let down. But as you can see, the saint, Saint Romanus at the top, is actually become sort of one with the stone. And again, that is the sort of that's the sort of thing that she likes to tease out, much like. And I think, again, this is a whole different way of looking at these two objects in a way that we normally don't see at a gallery. I think there's also an element of a transformation and metamorphosis. The saint becomes the stone that he contemplates. I think there's also a certain element of translation, of making one thing into another. And that's another common denominator in the exhibitions that you can see at the National Gallery, National Portrait Gallery, and later on at the RA by Tacita Dean. I think she's very interested in this concept of translation in principle. That is, on the one hand, quite literal, when she is actually making a film about the poet and translator Michael Hamburger, which is on display, I believe, at the National Portrait Gallery. Mm-hmm. One of the best, or most exciting translators, most gifted translators of the 20th century, when this is something we can see when she shows us a translation from life into stone, of course also picking at that boundary of still life at the same moment, and it is something that we can see when she confronts images with one another, letting us decide which one is the actual still life, which one is the actual photograph from life or from the model, as for instance in the Thomas Demand picture that we saw. Which is, I was going to say, that is of course the translation, if ever there was one, of an object. Yeah. And I think it's also something that we see in the Ronnie Horn pictures, which are also in the room that we're currently looking at. There we are. I find this a rather exciting wall in the exhibition, and the Ronnie Horn in the center is beautiful because they are the same. Well, I've tried my best to find any difference between them, but and this is partly what happens, of course, with these two images. You want to you want them to be different, for them to come alive, as it were. But of course, they are, as the title indicates, they are dead owls. And but that again is that play with the concept of what is still life, what is death, and she does that with the juxtaposition there with a Sparrowhawk by Jacopo de Barbarie, an early 16th century painting. What a beautiful still life of a bird, a sparrowhawk perched on this little bar. To which it is attached, it can't actually flee, where it has to sit still, whether it likes it or not. And then, with the film at the top there, very high up of a bird on a wire, where we, for about 3 minutes, watched this bird sitting there and tweeting. You can actually hear that this is the only film in the exhibition that actually has sound. And you can hear it tweeting, and then at the very end it sort of plunges away. Again, this is pure chance, of course, because she must have just sat there with her camera in Los Angeles looking up at a wire with a bird on it. Again, that all these pictures, there's a Grand John there of an empty bird cage. They all invite us to contemplate these various states, if you want, of what a bird can be, either dead or perched or sitting and plunging perhaps to its death, or or indeed absent, as in that little painting of a bird cage. So I think that I find that one of the, there we go. I think it also is interesting. Someone pointed out to me, I think quite rightly, she clearly she loves these diagonals. This is something that, again, as I said earlier, it's always fascinating when you walk in the gallery with an artist, because they always point out things that you never really thought of yourself, because they look differently, you know. And I think this is I can't imagine this is chance. She must have had her own film in mind when she chose this Jacopo de Barbarie on the left there. What's the next? Oh, the next one is a close-up of our beautiful dead owls. Yeah, I think it's been a great pleasure really doing this. We get out of our comfort zone, and Daniel has the great advantage that in his job he can get out of his comfort zone all the time.
I think what I also really enjoy about the exhibition, and I wonder if you might agree with us, or if it's something that if you have a chance to see the exhibition either for the first time or the second time, if you will maybe disagree, but I think it's also an exhibition that is really about looking. It's a question of us looking at those birds that look back at us. It's a question of the pacing of that looking. Walking around Tacita Dean's exhibition, I think, encourages us to look at artworks in a different way, with gaps in between, making different connections, filling in the gaps ourselves. And it conditions us, I believe, to break with a way of looking at art that is one painting after another, that is structured through timelines, which we usually prescribe, that is structured through schools, Flemish, Dutch, German, English. And she really throws all of that up in the air, lets us rediscover our own taxonomies, lets us rediscover our own ways of making connection with the paintings. And once you come back from that exhibition into the regular exhibition spaces, into the regular schools, timelines, and the ways that we organize the paintings here at the National Gallery, I think it helps us actually question those things that we usually take for granted. All of a sudden, the pace with which we watch the Rubens hang, that is just very adjacent to the show, gains a different valence in our eyes as well. Coming out of Tacita Dean, you start making connections between the paintings that you perhaps hadn't been aware of for a long time or ever. I think it's a tremendous service to art, to looking at art, and to our way of questioning the way that institutions like us are also displaying art, and that's something that seems very, very healthy to me.
Yes, I think we should not end on a dead bird, because one of the things she said to me all the time, because she was choosing all these dead birds, and she said, "Well, I hate dead birds," she said to me. So we should end on this. And indeed, if you exit the exhibition, you will sort of see this picture again by William Nicholson. What a beautiful painting. Maybe we should, if there's anyone who would like to ask a question, perhaps, I think we should open that up. If there is any appetite for that. Is there? Come on, this is your chance. I can't see you, that is my problem. Is there anyone who would like to say something? Some hesitant there, no?
Yes, please.
The spiritual elements that's themed through a lot of the work, the saints and the birds, and even the meditative quality that exists within the conceptualization of still life, and to what extent is the artist in that framing as well?
So the question is about the spiritual quality of the exhibition, of some of the works in the exhibition, and to what extent the artist is reflected in that. Do you want to say something to the artist?
No, I'm not sure what the answer is.
Yeah. I think I can't speak for the artist in terms of her own spirituality, but I think the genre of still life that she deliberately chose to work with does have that tradition, does have that quality of spirituality that we can especially see if you walk into the first room on the left-hand side, where the artist really juxtaposes three different images, very simple still lives that involve usually bread, wine, water, and in one case cheese. There's also knives. In the middle of those two, well, she chooses two historical still lifes, oil paintings. In the middle of that is actually a photograph by the American artist Cy Twombly, also of a glass of water with a piece of bread on it. I think that's the moment that's perhaps the most overtly playing with the religious traditions that come with the genre of still life. Representations of bread and wine as symbols of the blood and body of Christ. Allusions to the transubstantiation that is, I think, also prevalent in discussions about photography, which is something that she, as an artist who's interested in moving images, is very aware of. I think we can also see that in the themes of the head of St. John the Baptist, the plate, and even the large-scale Philip Guston painting that we have in that exhibition. But I think it's not a religious exhibition. I think she takes these traditions, she's aware of them. In a certain way, I think she empties the paintings of the direct religious connotations and allows us to fill them with our own way of looking at the works. And that can be in a contemplative mood, that can be in a mood that allows for a spiritual experience. I think there's also other ways to look at it. I think that we've experienced visitors who find the entire exhibition very funny because there's a lot of humor, and humor as a literary device also works with very similar methods that we can see in the exhibition, leaving blanks, having a particular rhythm, having oppositions and juxtapositions that are not immediately in sync, but rather out of sync. So there's different ways of looking at it, but I think it allows for a spiritual experience if that is something you're interested in.
Yeah, and in much the same way that she likes nature to have created its own forms, right. There is a slightly spiritual element to that, if you want. She made this film, for example, of the sunset, where she tried to observe this moment when the sun actually goes down below the horizon, where there apparently is very difficult to observe. There is a purple flash. I'm not quite sure how that works. But there is, because of the spectrum of the light that somehow disappears over the horizon, there is a purple flash, and she actually went to film a sunset over. You have to do that over the sea, I think, otherwise it doesn't work at all, or at least a very, very flat horizon. And then she captured it. She also claims that can only be captured with an actual film, rather than with digital. Because there's really that one frame where all of a sudden you do see this purple flash on the horizon, which is a sort of, one of those strange natural phenomena that to which she attaches some spiritual significance, I suppose, and otherwise only known through tales from sailors who claim to have seen it. But it clearly exists, and she's very proud that the people next to her who tried to capture the same thing with a digital camera never found it.
And there's something to be learned from that. Yeah. Please.
Anyone else? I think, well...
In that case, thank you very much for
joining us.
Yeah. And we hope you enjoy the exhibition.